The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
Welcome back to our study of 2 Timothy. In this segment, we are ready for 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6. Let's begin by reading verses 6 through 8. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. And not to me only, but also to all who have loved His appearing. As this letter of Paul's nears its conclusion, Paul says to Timothy, I am already being poured out as a drink offering. Paul has said something like this in the past. During his first Roman imprisonment, he had written the letter to the Philippians. And in Philippians 2:17, he had said to them, yes, and if I am being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. A drink offering, according to the law of Moses, was of wine, and it was made in conjunction with at least some of the sacrifices of the law. And since it was made in conjunction with a sacrifice, it was necessarily involved with death. And that's the connection here. Paul knows that he is about to die, that he is about to lay down his life for the cause of Christ. When he had written to the Philippians earlier, he had said, if I am being poured out as a drink offering. There had been some uncertainty in his mind as to what the future held. But the uncertainty is gone. In this instance, Paul knows what to expect. He says he is already being poured out. The wheels of injustice are already turning. Paul knows that what he's experiencing now is the beginning of the end. The time of my departure, Timothy, is at hand. The time that I'm going to leave this world is near. And this is the reason Paul gave those commands he did back in verses 1 through 5. And I note particularly verse 5. Remember there he had said, but you, Timothy, be watchful in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. Now those were things that Timothy might need to hear at any time, but especially at this time, because Paul is about to leave. Paul is saying in essence to Timothy, Timothy, I'm passing the baton to you. Not that Timothy is going to serve as an apostle, but the responsibility for preaching the gospel and caring for the churches to the degree that an evangelist could, that's going to fall on Timothy. Paul is about to leave the race. He's about to leave the stadium. The next lap is going to be Timothy's. But Paul is not despondent about this. Paul knows his future is bright because he has lived his life right in Christ Jesus. He says in verse 7, I have fought the good fight. He had done what he had urged Timothy to do in 1 Timothy 6:12, where he had said, fight the good fight of faith. Paul had done that. Now the word for fought here is the Greek word agonizomai. It's the word from which we get agony. And when I hear that word, when I hear fight, I think of something related to the military, but the primary meaning of this word had to do with engaging in a contest, like an athletic contest. And that's how Paul uses the word in 1 Corinthians 9:25. He's talking about athletic competition, and the word's actually translated competes in that passage. And I think that is probably how Paul intends it here. That fits best with the overall context. Paul, like an athlete in the Olympic Games who would struggle to achieve victory, had himself struggled and fought to achieve victory in this event that we call the Christian life. And that event was very near its conclusion. He says to Timothy, I have finished the race. Paul had told the Ephesian elders years before, in Acts chapter 20, verse 24, that his intention was to finish his race with joy. And that was as good as done. There were just a few more steps before the race was finally over. And notice, as we're reading these things, notice the absence of regret. I wouldn't say that Paul didn't have any regrets. I'm sure as a human being he probably had some, but none of those regrets were so great as to override his conviction that his life since his conversion had been a life that was well lived. He had done what he was supposed to do. He had lived an obedient life. Like Jesus, who in his prayer before the disciples the day before he was crucified could pray to God, John chapter 17, verse 4, I have finished the work which you have called me to do, which you have given me to do. So Paul could say, I have done what I needed to do. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Like the athlete that Paul mentioned back in chapter 2, verse 5, who must compete according to the rules, Paul had done it. In keeping the faith, he had competed according to God's rules. He had been obedient to the Lord in his preaching. He had fulfilled his ministry. And he had been obedient to the Lord in his personal life. And so, verse 8, he says, finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. Laid up, that is, reserved. It makes me think of 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, where we read of an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you. God had set Paul's reward aside. In other words, it was waiting for Paul. That's the idea here. And that reward Paul calls a crown of righteousness. Now, the word crown here is the Greek word stephanos. It's referring to that circlet or that garland that was made of leaves that an athlete would receive in the Olympic Games. It's the symbol of triumph. Paul sees himself as a victor, and he was. In 1 Corinthians 9, when Paul had dwelt at length on this idea of the Christian race, here's what he'd written. 1 Corinthians 9, beginning in verse 24. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, that's the Stephanos, but we for an imperishable crown. That imperishable crown, Paul had run long for it, and he knew it was reserved for him. And he calls it a crown of righteousness, given in recognition of his righteousness and or because it signifies his entrance into the new heavens and the new earth in which righteousness dwells. In heaven, there's not going to be any more sin. The new heavens and the new earth are going to be filled with righteousness, and sin will be something of the past. And I think this probably goes without saying, but I do want to take a moment to say that this crown is not to be understood literally. It is a symbol of our eternal reward. Paul describes it, it's described in other ways elsewhere in the New Testament. For example, in James chapter 1, verse 12, and in Revelation chapter 2, verse 10, it's called the crown of life. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 4, it's called the crown of glory. Here, of course, it's called the crown of righteousness. Each of these is a reference to the same reward. They're just highlighting different aspects related to that reward. And notice, by the way, that Paul does not say he's going to receive this crown at his death. He expects to receive it at a later date. He says, the Lord, the righteous judge, will give it to me on that day. What day? Well, not the day of his death. The day of the Lord's return. Jesus Christ is going to give him his reward on the judgment day. Until then, upon his death, Paul would wait with the righteous in paradise. Luke chapter 23, verse 43, that part of Hades that the Jews referred to as Abraham's bosom. Luke chapter 16, verse 23. Based on my studies of the Bible, the best evidence tells me that that's where Paul is even now. He is awaiting with the righteous in paradise. Those who die know when they awaken to those spiritual realms, they know what their eternal fate is, but the final sentencing, the final reward or punishment is not given till Jesus returns. And Paul says, this crown of righteousness, it's not going to be given to me only, but to all who have loved his appearing, to those who have loved Jesus' appearing. B.W. Johnson wrote this, all can have the same hope, all who serve him and would love to see him come as their best friend shall have the same crown. Do we love his appearing? Each of us should look in our own hearts and ask ourselves that honest question. Do I love the idea of Jesus returning? If I knew that Jesus Christ was going to return today, how would I feel about that? That's a pretty good gauge of where I am with God and what I need to be doing if I need to change anything with respect to my life. The Apostle John loved the idea of Jesus appearing and returning. In Revelation chapter 22, verse 20, he who testifies to these things says, surely I am coming quickly. And what was John's response? Amen. Even so, come, Lord Jesus. May that be the attitude that each one of us has. So, here in chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, Paul gave kind of his final injunctions, his final pleas to Timothy. Here in verses 6 through 8, he has rejoiced in the promise related to his future. And now in verse 9, Paul is going to begin his closing remarks. He's going to start addressing some unrelated but urgent matters. So let's begin in verse 9 and read to verse 13. Be diligent to come to me quickly, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica. Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry. And Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. Bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books, especially the parchments. Be diligent, he says, to come to me quickly. The time for his execution is not very far off, and he does want to see Timothy before his departure from this world. We discussed that at length in chapter 1, verse 4. But that is not the only reason Paul wants Timothy to come to him quickly, and that's going to become evident as we continue in our studies here of chapter 4. Notice verse 10, Paul says, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. We don't know very much about Demas. His name is a shortened version of Demetrius, like calling Jonathan John or a Peter Pete. And we know he had been with Paul during Paul's first imprisonment. He's mentioned in Colossians chapter 4, verse 14, and in Philemon, verse 24. But apart from these references, what is said here is all we know about him. And what is said here is sad. Paul says, he's forsaken me. He's deserted me. And the reason he's left is not to go do the work. There's no implication that's the case. He's loved this present world. It makes me think of 1 John 2, verse 15. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. You know, Demas, it would have appeared, had been willing to go further than most. He'd traveled with Paul. No doubt he had seen hardship and probably some danger. But he had come to a place while Paul was here in Rome and in prison where he was not willing to go far enough. Brother E.M. Zur had this to say. Demas had been associated with Paul in his travels, and for a while, even after the apostle was taken to Rome in chains. But he failed to stand the test when persecution, and I might add, death, threatened, being more interested in the pleasures of this world than in the cause of Christ. I think of what Jesus said in Luke 14:26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, in his own life also, 7 things, Jesus says, he cannot be my disciple. We have to be willing to lay it all at the feet of Christ. I surrender all. Demas, I hope, repented of this decision. Some have suggested that the Demetrius, who's mentioned so well, so positively in 3 John verse 12, is Demas later in life, or might have been, and that's a pleasant thought, but it's certainly not something we can nail down with any certainty. What finally became of Demas, only the Lord knows. The sad fact of the matter is, what we do know is that in Paul's darkest hour, Demas left him. Paul says Crescens has departed for Galatia. This is the only time we read of Crescens in the New Testament. His name is a Roman name. That doesn't tell us much, but it gives us a little bit. What is evident here, or seems evident, is that he was a co-worker of Paul's. And Paul says he's departed for Galatia. Interestingly, some manuscripts, ancient manuscripts, say Gaul. And Crescens is actually mentioned very briefly by Eusebius, the quote-unquote father of church history, in his work Ecclesiastical History. Eusebius wrote somewhere between 310 and 325 AD. So there had been a lot of time since the time of Paul. But Eusebius mentions that Crescens was sent to Gaul. That said, we've got over 25,000 manuscripts of the New Testament that scholars have been able to look at and check and recheck and cross-check, and it is the the opinion of scholars that Galatia is the right reading here, as every translation I checked includes that as its reading. So I'm going to go with that. Crescens had departed for Galatia. Galatia was in Central Asia Minor. It was east of Ephesus, but still in the western part of what is today modern-day Turkey. And if that is in fact where he went, why would he have gone there? Well, likely to help the churches. We know there were multiple churches in Galatia. Galatians chapter 1, verse 2, and 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1. And probably Crescens had gone there to help one or more of those groups. Paul says Titus has departed for Dalmatia. Now, Titus we know. We have a book of the Bible named after him. He's the only other evangelist besides Timothy to whom an entire book is written. His work had been in Crete, Titus chapter 1, verse 5. But apparently his work there had been completed, or at least he was not needed anymore, because he had had time to go to Rome and had now departed from Rome to go to Dalmatia. Now, Dalmatia was not very far from Rome. Dalmatia covered the same geography as present-day Albania and part of Yugoslavia. It was partly equivalent with the Roman province of Illyricum. And to get there, all Titus would have had to do is cross the narrow peninsula that is Italy, go over to the east shore from the western shore where Rome was, then cross the Adriatic Sea, and he would be right there at the coastline of Dalmatia. The coastline of Dalmatia ran parallel to Italy's eastern coastline. So he wasn't very far away. He wasn't going to be very far away from Rome, and that interests me. I don't know why. There may be no connection with what I'm about to say at all, but I wonder if Titus had gone somewhere fairly close so that he could return before Paul's execution. But I, of course, speculate. But the fact of the matter is that Demas had left, Crescens and Titus had left, and Paul says at the beginning of verse 11, only Luke is with me. Luke, Paul's companion through much of the work recorded for us in Acts, remains with him still, regardless of what it might mean for him. As a writer, Luke may have been serving as Paul's amanuensis. Remember how in Romans 16:22 that the book of Romans, they were Paul's words inspired by God, but Tertius was the one who had actually written them down. Perhaps the actual letter of 2 Timothy was in fact penned by Luke. That's a possibility. We know Luke was a writer as he wrote 2 books of the New Testament. As a physician, Luke may have been able to attend to any medical needs that may have existed for Paul. Paul is not a young man. Already during his first imprisonment, he called himself the aged. We saw that over in the book of Philemon. Whether any of those things was going on or not, Paul certainly had Luke there for companionship and encouragement. But Paul wanted more companionship. He wanted more support. Luke is with him, yes, but only Luke. Paul wanted to see Timothy, and Paul says to Timothy, get Mark and bring him with you. Now, this is John, whose surname was Mark. Acts chapter 12, verse 12, who was called Mark. Acts chapter 15, verse 37. He was a cousin of Barnabas. Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. He is the author of the second gospel, based on very ancient references that we have to that fact. He is a man whom Peter called my son. That's interesting. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. Perhaps the relationship that Paul and Timothy had existed also between Peter and Mark. But Mark had also left Paul and Barnabas all the way back in Acts 13, years before. He had gone with Paul and Barnabas on the first journey, serving as their assistant, and before the journey had gotten very far in, he had left them and gone to Jerusalem. And that had not sat well with Paul, because when it came time for the second journey in Acts chapter 15, and Paul and Barnabas were thinking of going back and visiting the churches that they had gotten started, and Barnabas said, let's take John Mark with us, Paul was unwilling to do that. And it resulted, of course, in Barnabas and John Mark going one way and Paul and Silas going another. But somewhere in the ensuing years, John Mark had redeemed himself with Paul. And Paul now says he's useful to me for ministry. This had already been the case for a little while, it appears, because Mark had been with Paul during his first imprisonment. He's mentioned in Colossians 4:10 and Philemon 24. So just like Mark had been with him during the first imprisonment, Paul says to Timothy, bring Mark here again. He's useful to me for ministry. And that raises an interesting question. Paul is in prison and he's about to die. What ministry? Well, I certainly can't answer that question except to say this: whatever he could get done before he died. Paul was going to keep on keeping on until Nero made that impossible. And that's the right spirit for a servant of the Lord to have. Do what we can while we can. Verse 12, Paul says, Tychicus I have sent to Asia. Now, Tychicus is mentioned 5 times in the New Testament. He's mentioned once in Acts and in 4 of Paul's letters: Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Timothy, obviously, and in Titus. We know a few things about Tychicus. He was from Asia, Acts chapter 20, verse 4, which is, in fact, where Ephesus was. And he was a Jew by descent. We can gather that from a careful reading of Colossians 4, verses 7 through 11. Paul thought well of Tychicus. He twice called him a beloved brother and a faithful minister, Ephesians 6:21 and Colossians 4:7. He had accompanied Paul during at least part of Paul's journey to Jerusalem to deliver the financial gift from the Gentiles, and he had afterward made trips at Paul's instigation to Ephesus, Ephesians 6:21, to Colossae, Colossians 4:7, and perhaps to Crete, Titus chapter 3, verse 12. This is a man who was busy in the work of the Lord. And on this occasion, Paul says, I have sent him to Ephesus. Now, he doesn't say, I am sending. He says, I have sent. It reads like he had already been sent to Ephesus before Paul wrote this letter to Timothy. And we note also that in verse 11, Paul had said, only Luke is with me. And I bring all that up because the idea has been floated that maybe Tychicus carried this letter to Timothy. But this reading, I think, weighs against that interpretation. It looks to me like Tychicus had been sent to Ephesus before this letter was penned. Why had he been sent to Ephesus? Probably, again, to help the church there. And it's possible also he'd been sent ahead to be in a position to kind of cover Timothy's responsibilities when Timothy answered Paul's summons to head to Rome. But again, there's all kinds of room to speculate. We can't say for sure. Finally, here in verse 13, Paul says to Timothy, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come. Now, we don't know anything about Carpus except what we have here. He's never mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament. Troas was a city northwest of Ephesus, about 130 miles. It was right on the eastern coast of the Aegean Sea, just as Ephesus was. And there were some interesting things that had happened there. It was there that Paul had the vision years before of a man from Macedonia saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. It was there that Eutychus had fallen out of the 3rd-story window, and Paul had raised him from the dead, it appears. So some important and interesting things had happened in that city, and it would appear that somewhere along the line, Paul had maybe left his cloak there while visiting with the intent of coming back to get it or having it picked up by somebody else in the future. Whatever the case, he certainly couldn't go there for it now. Now, what is this cloak? Well, based on one source I consulted, it is a seamless, thick woolen garment with a hole in the center for the head, like a poncho. So you've got this thing like a poncho that's thick and woolen. This would be very warm, and that may be why Paul wants Timothy to pick it up, because remember he does say here in verse 21, do your utmost to come before winter. The Romans did not pamper their prisoners. Far from it. Paul knows winter is coming, and he may just be trying to make sure that he's ready for it, that he's got what he needs to be protected from the cold. It may also be that a nice woolen cloak would come in awful handy when it's time to lie down on the straw the Romans may have been giving him to sleep on. We just don't know all the exact circumstances, but Paul's not a young man, and a simple creature comfort like this may have been very, very important to him as winter was headed his way. He tells Timothy, bring the books, especially the parchments. Now, what are these books? We don't know. Paul uses the Greek word biblion, B-I-B-L-I-O-N. It does look like our English word Bible. And this word is used in the New Testament for individual books of the Bible. I'll give you some examples. Luke chapter 4, verse 17, when Jesus was in the synagogue at Nazareth, he was handed the book, it's the same Greek word, of the prophet Isaiah, and when he had opened the book. Now, it's a scroll, but translated book in our Bibles. In John chapter 20, verse 30, truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. What book? Well, the book of John. So in Luke 4:17, we have this word used of the book of Isaiah. In John chapter 20, verse 30, we have it used of the book of John. And then in Revelation chapter 1, verse 11, Jesus says to John, what you see, write in a book. What book? Well, what would become the book of Revelation. So it is possible that when Paul says to Timothy, bring the books, that these are in fact copies of letters he had written or other New Testament books of the Bible. That is possible. It is also possible, though, that there's something else altogether. Anyone who had done Paul's kind of work, and for as long as he had done it, had probably compiled some papers. They may be papers of contact information, addresses, notes he'd made for teaching or other related matters. The less we know, the easier it is to speculate. But he says something very interesting here as we begin to draw this to a close. Don't only bring the books, Timothy, especially the parchments. Especially the parchments. The word for parchments here is membrana. It's the word from which we get membrane. And it is referring to manuscripts that are written on animal skins. Those books may have been written on papyrus, but what Paul refers to here was written on animal skin. They would write on calf skin, sheep, goat, antelope, interestingly. But animal skin was much more durable than papyrus. In later centuries, it would become the preferred writing surface. And to Paul, these parchments were especially important. Bring the books, but especially the parchments. What are the parchments? Are they books of the Bible? Are they inspired writings? Maybe copies of the Old Testament and or the New Testament? Maybe. The fact that they were so important to Paul makes us think maybe, just maybe, that was the case. But again, we don't know. This does draw us to the conclusion of this segment of our study of 2 Timothy chapter 4. In our next segment, we'll plan to conclude our study of the book, and we'll begin in verse 14, Lord willing. Hope you can join us then.